Mom said, "Your rent will be doubled to help your sister." I nodded, but even then, I already knew they'd regret every part of what they were about to do. That was the moment everything in my life shifted, though my parents didn't notice it. They thought I was agreeing because I had no choice. They thought I was the same quiet, obedient daughter who always gave in whenever they pushed me. But inside, something hard and cold settled into place. I wasn't agreeing out of weakness. I was agreeing because I already knew exactly how this story would end. I'm Rowena Hale, 27 years old, living in the small guest house behind my parents' home. It wasn't fancy, but it gave me peace and space to breathe. At least, that's what it used to give me before they decided I was responsible for fixing my sister's life again. Marceline, my older sister, had always been the golden child. Everything she touched was praised, even when it fell apart. Every mistake she made was excused before she opened her mouth. And every time she needed money, support, or someone to clean up her messes, my parents turned to me, because I was responsible, steady, and could handle it. So when she lost her job, again, they instantly looked at me as if it was my duty to rescue her. Mom came into the guest house with that tight smile she wore whenever she was about to demand something unreasonable. Dad stood behind her, arms folded, silent but supportive of whatever she said. "We've decided," Mom said, "that your rent needs to be doubled. Marceline needs help right now, and family sticks together. You're doing well." "She isn't. You can manage this." I didn't argue. I didn't explain that I'd already been covering half the groceries, paying for repairs, and stepping in whenever Marceline spiraled. I didn't remind them that Marceline was 30 and had never held a job longer than 6 months. I just nodded, because while they thought they were tightening their control over me, all they were really doing was showing me exactly how little they valued me beyond what I could provide. The silence after I agreed should have told them something. I wasn't upset or shocked or frustrated. I was calm, too calm. And if they had bothered to really look at me, they would have seen something new in my eyes. Not fear. Not hurt. Distance. The kind that forms when you finally see people for who they truly are. Inside, I was already making decisions. Quiet, careful, long overdue decisions. I didn't need to shout or fight. I didn't need to explain myself. They had given me the final push I needed to stop trying to earn their approval and start protecting my own life. They thought doubling my rent would keep me tied to them. They had no idea it would be the very thing that set me free. Growing up, I learned very early that my family didn't treat me and Marceline the same way. She was always the special one, the one my parents bragged about even when she wasn't doing anything worth bragging about. If she failed, they called it bad luck. If I succeeded, they said it was expected, because I was the responsible one. It was like my whole life was built around supporting her, even when she didn't deserve it. Mom, Cecily, had a soft spot for her that never made sense. She protected Marceline from every consequence, no matter how serious it was. Dad, Raymond, followed right behind her, backing every excuse Marceline came up with. And whenever Marceline created a problem, they always turned to me with the same line. "Family helps each other. You know that, Rowena." But family always meant me fixing her mistakes. It never once meant Marceline taking responsibility. When they told me she lost her job again, they said it like she was the victim. Mom sighed dramatically, saying it was because her boss misunderstood her. Dad shook his head like the world had been cruel to her for no reason. But I knew the truth before they even finished talking. Marceline always had a misunderstanding, whenever she didn't feel like listening to authority or following rules. She had a way of twisting stories so my parents would feel bad for her and jump to protect her. Later, I learned from someone she used to work with that Marceline had talked back to her supervisor, skipped shifts, and refused to do simple tasks. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was her own behavior catching up with her. But if I dared to point that out, Mom would accuse me of being jealous, and Dad would say I lacked empathy. Whenever I hesitated to help, they used guilt like a tool. Mom would look disappointed and ask, "Rowena, how can you watch your sister struggle?" Dad would add, "We raised you to care about family." It didn't matter that I had my own bills, my own stress, my own life. To them, I existed to make things easier for Marceline. And every time they pulled that guilt on me, I felt something inside me shrink a little more. Not because I didn't want to help, helping is in my nature, but because it was never appreciated. It was expected, like my role in this family was to carry all the weight so Marceline could float through life untouched. Their pressure wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and constant. The kind of pressure that wears you down slowly until you don't even realize how much you're giving up just to keep the peace. But this time, something felt different. When they came to me again, asking me to sacrifice more for Marceline, I didn't feel guilty. I felt tired. Deep, bone-level tired. It was the first time I let myself see how unfair it had always been. That tiredness was the beginning of the resentment I had pushed down for years finally rising to the surface. And once it showed up, it didn't go away. I didn't plan to snoop or dig for the truth. I honestly wanted to believe my parents were just struggling to help Marceline and thought doubling my rent was the only way. But a few days later, I overheard something that changed everything. I was in the kitchen getting water when I heard my mom talking on the phone. Her voice was low, excited, almost proud. She said something about seed money, starting fresh, and finally getting the business off the ground. At first, I thought she meant someone else. But then she said Marceline's name, and my whole body went still. A business? With my rent money? They had told me it was for food, bills, and helping her get back on her feet. They made it sound like she was barely surviving. But now I was hearing that they were pouring all of it into some business idea. And the worst part, it wasn't even a new idea. It was the same business I suggested years ago when I was fresh out of college. Something small, something doable. They laughed at me then, said I didn't understand how the world worked. They said it was silly and not realistic. But now that Marceline wanted it, suddenly it was worth investing in. That realization didn't hurt, it burned. It wasn't just about money. It was about the way they always treated my ideas like they meant nothing, but treated hers like gold even when they were careless or lazy. Later that night, I asked them calmly what the doubled rent was really for. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I just asked. Mom's face tightened immediately. Dad avoided my eyes. And then Mom said, "Rowena, why would you ask such a thing? You're overthinking again." Overthinking. That word they always used when they wanted to make me doubt myself. So I asked again, this time more direct. And Mom snapped. "Why are you being dramatic? Your sister is struggling. Why can't you just support her without questioning everything?" Dad added, "You always take things the wrong way. Just trust us." That was when it hit me, they weren't denying it. They were just trying to make me feel guilty for noticing. They wanted my money, but they didn't want me to know where it was going. And when I found out, they wanted to make me feel wrong for asking. It was like they wanted me to believe I had no right to question them, no right to protect myself, no right to ask how my own money was being used. I sat there, quiet, letting their words roll over me. And something inside me finally shifted. I realized that no matter how much I gave, no matter how patient or understanding I tried to be, they would always see me as the backup plan, the person they could drain whenever Marceline needed something. I didn't argue with them. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain why it hurt. I simply nodded, stood up, and walked away. But in my mind, the decision was already made. This would be the last time they used me like this. After that night, I stopped expecting anything from my parents. I didn't argue with them, and I didn't bring up the business again. On the outside, I acted calm, quiet, and cooperative. But inside, I had already started planning my way out. I knew I couldn't keep living under their control. I needed my own life, my own space, and my own freedom. So I began to look at everything carefully. My bank account, my savings, my monthly expenses, and even the small opportunities one had ignored before because I was too busy helping everyone else. At work, I started paying more attention to conversations. I work at a restoration firm, and we often meet contractors, property owners, and project managers. Normally, I kept things professional and simple. But now, I listened for anything that hinted at new openings or chances to grow. When one of the senior contractors mentioned an upcoming project in another state, I kept that in my mind. When my manager talked about expanding the team, I asked a few quiet questions. Nothing obvious, nothing loud, just enough to understand my options. I also reached out to a few contacts I trusted, people who had always treated me kindly, people who knew how capable I was. We talked casually about future plans, career paths, and housing opportunities. No one knew I was preparing to leave my parents' property. I didn't want any whispers to travel back to them. This plan had to stay mine alone. Every night, I sat at my small dining table with a notebook, writing down numbers, ideas, and steps. I was careful. I didn't rush. I made sure every detail was right before I moved to the next. I learned quickly that planning for freedom can feel as peaceful as it feels powerful. Meanwhile, at home, something strange happened. The more I stayed quiet, the more entitled my family became. Marceline walked around with confidence she had never earned. She made comments like, "It's good you're finally contributing in a real way." My parents talked about expenses without even looking at me, as if my money automatically belonged to them. They didn't see what was happening. They thought my silence meant obedience. They thought my calm meant I had accepted everything. They didn't notice the small things, like how I spent more time at work, how I stopped asking about family matters, how I no longer offered help before they asked. They didn't know that while they were getting comfortable, I was getting ready. I still paid the doubled rent, sliding the money over without a word. And every time I did, I felt the same thing, distance growing between us, layer by layer. It was almost funny how they took my cooperation as a sign that they had more power. They had no idea they were giving me all the space I needed to create my exit. They thought I was staying. But every quiet step I took was bringing me closer to the moment I would walk away for good. As the days passed, my parents became bolder, almost careless, in the way they treated me. It was like once they realized I wasn't fighting back, they saw me as someone they could keep taking from without limits. Mom started making comments like, "You can cover this, right?" whenever a bill came up. Dad acted like my paycheck existed only to solve whatever problem appeared in the house. They didn't ask, they expected. And Marceline, she became worse than both of them combined. One morning, she walked into the guest house without knocking, sat on my couch, and said with a straight face, "You know, you're lucky Mom and Dad raised us the way they did. All your stability? All your success? You owe that to the family." She said it like I hadn't worked for anything, like the long hours, careful saving, and sacrifices I made meant nothing. I just looked at her, feeling this cold, empty space open inside me. She didn't notice. She never noticed when she crossed a line. But the real breaking point came 2 days later. I kept my grandfather's watch in a small wooden box on my shelf. It was old, simple, and scratched in a few places, but it meant the world to me. My grandfather was the one person in the family who treated me fairly, who saw me as capable, who believed in me without conditions. When he passed, that watch was all I had left of him. One evening, I opened the box and found it empty. My chest tightened instantly. I searched the shelf, the drawer, the whole guest house, even though I already knew deep down it wasn't misplaced. The watch never left the box. Only someone desperate or greedy would take something so personal. I went to the house and asked if anyone had seen it. Mom acted confused. Dad shrugged. But Marceline refused to look at me. She just muttered, "Why are you making such a big deal out of an old watch?" That was enough for me to know. I checked a local pawn shop the next morning. The owner remembered her immediately. He even showed me the signed slip with her name on it. She had stolen it. Something that meant nothing to her, but everything to me. And she sold it. The moment I held that pawn ticket in my hand, something in me hardened. I wasn't angry in the loud, explosive way. It was deeper. Quiet, steady, and final. I realized my family didn't just see me as someone to use. They didn't see me at all. Not my feelings, not my boundaries, not my worth. They had crossed a line they couldn't return from. I walked out of that shop knowing one thing with absolute clarity. They were going to learn exactly what it felt like to lose something they took for granted. After Marceline pawned my grandfather's watch, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to take control, quietly and carefully. I started by moving my savings into a separate account, one my parents had no access to. I made sure every dollar was accounted for, every transaction invisible to them. It felt strange at first, like sneaking around, but it also felt right. For the first time in years, I was thinking about myself. Next, I gathered every important document I could find, bank statements, the original lease agreements, and even old papers my grandfather had left behind. I didn't want to miss a single detail. Every file I copied, every note I made, built the foundation for the plan I had been quietly crafting. I reached out to Jonas Wexler, a family friend and attorney who my parents always underestimated. They thought he was just some old acquaintance who liked to meddle. But I trusted him. I explained everything, Marceline's behavior, the doubling of my rent, and the way my parents had used me for years. Jonas didn't judge. Instead, he started looking into the legal side of things quietly, without letting my parents know. That's when I learned something I never expected. The guest house where I had lived all my adult life wasn't actually registered under my parents' names. It was part of my grandfather's estate, set aside for me. My parents had always acted like they owned it, but legally, it was mine. That discovery changed everything. I wasn't just someone being used. I had rights, real, enforceable rights that they had ignored or assumed didn't exist. I didn't confront them immediately. I knew better than to show my hand too early. They had spent years thinking I would always give in, always let them take advantage. Showing that I knew the truth would only make them suspicious. So I stayed calm, played along, and let them continue thinking they were in control. Meanwhile, I planned the steps carefully. Every move had to be quiet, precise, and unavoidable. Moving my money, preparing the documents, and talking to Jonas were only the first steps. I wanted the timing to be perfect so that when the moment came, I could act decisively, and they wouldn't have time to argue or manipulate me. I watched their behavior more closely now. Every comment, every demand, every look of entitlement gave me information. I saw how they assumed I would continue supporting Marceline and paying rent without question. I noticed how much they relied on me financially and emotionally, not realizing that reliance was about to become my advantage. For the first time in years, I felt powerful in a way I had never allowed myself to feel. Not the kind of power that comes from anger or revenge, but quiet, controlled power. The kind that builds from knowing your rights, planning carefully, and waiting for the right moment. Everything was set in motion, even if they had no idea. I was ready to move, and when I did, there would be no going back, for them or for me. I didn't make a scene when I handed the papers to my parents. I walked into the living room, placed the envelope on the table, and said quietly, "Read this." Inside was the official notice, because they tried to raise my rent illegally on the guest house, which legally belongs to my grandfather's estate. I was moving out. I was also filing a claim for misuse of estate property. At first, they didn't understand. Mom picked up the papers, her hands trembling slightly, and said, "What is this? Why would you do this?" Dad's face went pale. They had always counted on me silently covering the bills, paying for repairs, and basically keeping the house running while they focused on other things. They had assumed I would always be available, like an endless source of money and support. When they realized I wasn't bluffing, panic set in. Mom's voice grew louder as she demanded explanations, accusing me of being unfair and ungrateful. Dad tried to reason with me, but his words stumbled as he realized how much he relied on my help without ever acknowledging it. The calm surface I had kept was starting to crack their carefully maintained sense of control. Marceline, of course, exploded. She yelled, claiming that I was ruining everything she had planned. "You think you can just take everything away? Do you know what you're doing?" she shrieked, pointing a finger at me. It wasn't just anger. It was jealousy, pure entitlement spilling out like poison. She listed all the ways she thought she had been wronged, every tiny inconvenience I had supposedly caused her over the years, as if that justified her greed and the life she had lived at my expense. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I stayed calm, almost eerily calm, letting her words hang in the room. Every scream, every accusation, every desperate attempt to make me feel guilty only confirmed what I had already known. They had taken me for granted for too long. Their panic wasn't just emotional. I could see it in the way Mom fumbled with the bills, realizing the gap my money had been filling. I saw Dad calculating, silently, the financial hole they were facing. Even Marceline's business plans, which they had all been so eager to support, suddenly felt threatened. They hadn't expected that my decision to act quietly and legally would hit them where it hurt most. And through it all, I remained steady. No yelling, no pleading, no tears. I let them see the cracks, the desperation, the fear. I let them realize that their control was gone, and that I had finally claimed the one thing I had always been denied: my own voice, my own power, and my own rights. It wasn't over yet. They didn't know the full extent of what I had planned. But this was the first domino falling. And I smiled quietly to myself, knowing the rest would follow. A few weeks after serving the notice, I made my next move. I called a family meeting and laid everything out calmly, without anger or shouting. First, I told them about the new job I had been offered across the state. It came with a higher salary, a signing bonus, and company housing. I explained that I would be moving soon, and that this was a chance for me to finally have the independence I had been planning for all along. Then I revealed the second part. I had filed for full custodianship of the guest house, exactly as my grandfather intended. The papers were official, and the legal process had already begun. My parents' faces changed immediately. Mom's eyes went wide, Dad's jaw tightened, and Marceline's confident smirk disappeared. For the first time, they realized what losing me would actually mean. They weren't just losing a daughter. They were losing the steady financial support I had provided for years. They were losing control of the guest house they had always acted like they owned. Every quiet sacrifice I had made, every time I had stepped in to fix their problems, had been holding them up. And now it was gone. Marceline's reaction was immediate. She started panicking, demanding to know how she would fund her business plans. The funds she had been relying on, money I had quietly managed and controlled, were no longer available. She realized too late that her success had always depended on my support, even if she refused to see it. I watched them scramble, trying to think of ways to regain control or guilt me into changing my mind. They finally understood that their foundation, the person they had leaned on for everything, wasn't theirs to command anymore. Every assumption they had made about my compliance, my patience, and my willingness to be used was gone. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout or humiliate them. I simply presented the facts and let them sit in the reality they had ignored for so long. The calmness in my voice and the certainty in my actions hit harder than any argument could have. It was the moment they finally saw me clearly, not as the quiet, obedient daughter, but as someone capable, independent, and unshakable. Their entitlement, their reliance on me, and their disregard for my boundaries had all led to this point. I had taken back control of my life, my money, and my future. They had built their lives on my efforts, and now they were forced to face the consequences. And in that quiet, steady moment, I realized that my revenge wasn't about cruelty. It was about finally being seen, being respected, and walking away on my own terms. After I revealed everything, the house changed. My parents, Cecily and Raymond, started arguing constantly. Every conversation about money became a fight. Mom accused Dad of being careless with the finances, and Dad blamed Mom for letting things get out of hand. It was clear they had been relying on me more than they ever admitted, and now that support was gone. Marceline didn't know where to turn. She lashed out at both of them, blaming them for her troubles. "You never taught me how to manage anything," she shouted one afternoon, her face red and tears in her eyes. "This is your fault, not mine." The anger and panic in her voice exposed years of lies and manipulation she had used to keep herself in my parents' favor. I watched quietly as the family I had grown up with began to unravel. They tried to reach out to me, each in their own way, pretending to care or apologizing. Mom said, "Rowena, we didn't mean to hurt you. Can we fix this?" Dad added, "We just want our family back. Please don't go." Marceline even came to me, her voice shaking, begging for help. But I saw through it all. None of them were worried about me as a person. They weren't thinking about how I had felt all these years, about how they had treated me as if I was invisible except for the support I could provide. They were only upset because now I wasn't giving them money, control, or convenience anymore. I didn't answer them. I didn't argue or try to convince them I was hurt. Their attempts to manipulate me bounced off. I had spent too long being the family's backup plan, too long sacrificing my own happiness to cover for their mistakes. That chapter was over. The house felt heavy with tension. Every misplaced word, every small sound of frustration, reminded them that the balance had shifted. I could see the frustration in their eyes, the panic in their voices, and the fear that they might have lost the foundation they always depended on. Years of entitlement, lies, and manipulation were finally catching up to them. Marceline's business began to fall apart. Without my quiet support, without the money I had managed for them, her plans collapsed quickly. She tried blaming others, making excuses, but nothing worked. The cracks in her confidence, the years of depending on me to bail her out, became obvious to everyone. And for my parents, it was worse. The emotional weight of what they had done to me, of always treating me as less, started to hit them. But it was too late to fix. I had finally separated myself from their expectations, from their control, and from the role I had unwillingly played for so long. I stayed calm and steady, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The betrayal I had endured for years was now visible to everyone, undeniable and irreversible. For the first time, they were facing the consequences of their own actions, and I knew I would never be manipulated or used again. After everything settled, I finally stepped into the life I had been planning for years. I moved into my new place, a small apartment near my new job across the state. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine, completely mine, and for the first time I felt free. I didn't need anyone's approval, and I didn't have to answer to the constant demands that had once weighed on me. One of the first things I did was go to the pawn shop and get my grandfather's watch back. Holding it in my hand, I felt a quiet sense of reclaiming what was mine, not just the watch itself, but the respect and value I had been denied for so long. It reminded me that my worth was never tied to anyone else's greed or entitlement, and that finally, I had the power to protect it. I didn't make a show of my victories. I didn't gloat at my parents or Marceline. I didn't feel the need to shout about how clever I had been or how much they had underestimated me. My plan had never been about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about accountability. They had treated me unfairly, and I had taken the steps needed to stop being their fallback. That alone was enough. My parents and Marceline were left to deal with the fallout of their own actions. Bills went unpaid, plans fell apart, and their carefully maintained sense of control crumbled. I watched from a distance as the consequences of years of entitlement and manipulation unfolded. It wasn't my job to fix it, and I didn't want to. I had done what I needed to do, and the rest was entirely on them. I also didn't burn bridges. I didn't cut off my family in anger or act in ways I would later regret. I simply walked away from the life that had kept me trapped for so long. I let them live with the consequences of the choices they had made and finally allowed myself the peace I had been craving. For the first time, I felt grounded and steady. I didn't need applause or acknowledgement. I wasn't seeking to prove myself to anyone. I was done chasing approval, done sacrificing my peace, and done carrying the weight of other people's selfishness. I had my life, my independence, and my dignity. Sitting in my apartment with the watch on my wrist, I smiled quietly to myself. It wasn't a triumph full of fanfare, but it was real. I had walked away from manipulation, reclaimed my worth, and finally built a life where I belonged, not as someone else's backup, but as myself.